Can a painter transform unbearable trauma into visual ecstasy? This question sits at the heart of understanding ARSHILE GORKY, an artist who turned the nightmare of genocide and displacement into some of the most sensually charged abstract canvases of the 20th century. Born Vostanik Manug Adoyan in Armenia in the early 1900s, his exact birth year remains disputed among scholars, though 1904 is most commonly cited. Gorky witnessed horrors that would have broken most people. He survived the Armenian genocide, watched his mother die of starvation in his arms in 1919, and arrived in America at around 16 with nothing but an overwhelming need to reinvent himself entirely. What he built from that wreckage was a visual language so personal, so emotionally saturated, that it would fundamentally alter the trajectory of American painting. Let's be clear from the start. Gorky was a magnificent thief. He spent years essentially copying the European masters, particularly Cézanne and Picasso, with such devotion that critics dismissed him as derivative. But here's what those critics missed. Gorky wasn't just imitating these painters. He was consuming them, metabolizing their formal innovations, absorbing their techniques into his bloodstream until they became part of his own visual vocabulary. This wasn't plagiarism. This was how a largely self-taught immigrant artist educated himself in the language of modernism, preparing himself for the moment when his own authentic voice would finally emerge. And emerge it did, spectacularly, in the early 1940s. The transformation happened when Gorky encountered the surrealists who had fled Europe during World War II. Artists like André Breton and Roberto Matta introduced him to automatism, the practice of drawing or painting without conscious control, letting the subconscious mind guide the hand. For Gorky, this was revelatory. He had spent years building structural armatures borrowed from Cubism, creating compositions of geometric rigor. Now he discovered he could dissolve those structures, letting forms flow and mutate across the canvas with an organic freedom that felt simultaneously spontaneous and deeply considered. The technical foundation of Gorky's mature style rests on what critic Clement Greenberg memorably called tinted drawings. This phrase captures something essential about how Gorky worked during his final, most accomplished years. He would begin by establishing linear structures in thin, often black lines directly on the canvas, essentially drawing with paint. These lines had a nervous, trembling energy, never quite settling into stable contours. They suggested forms without fully defining them, creating a visual ambiguity where shapes could be read multiple ways simultaneously. Over and around these linear scaffolds, Gorky would then apply layers of thinned oil paint in luminous, jewel-like colors. This process of separating line from color was partly inspired by Joan Miro, whose 1941 retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art provided Gorky with a technical breakthrough. Miro showed him how to maintain compositional clarity while achieving painterly spontaneity. But where Miro's forms remained relatively discreet and playful, Gorky's became more ambiguous, more psychologically charged, more erotically suggestive. His shapes seemed to pulse and breathe on the canvas, appearing alternately vegetal, anatomical, microscopic, and cosmic. Their biomorphic forms, meaning they evoke living organisms without representing any specific creature or plant. This ambiguity is crucial. Gorky wanted viewers to bring their own associations to these shapes, to find in them echoes of their own experiences of nature, memory, and desire. The color in Gorky's mature paintings deserves particular attention. He moved away from the heavy, opaque paint application of his earlier Cubist-influenced work toward an increasingly diaphanous technique. He would thin his oil paints to the consistency of watercolor, then apply them in overlapping washes that created depths of translucent color. These stained passages had a liquid, glowing quality, with hues bleeding into one another across the canvas. The effect is simultaneously lush and delicate, creating color fields that seem to float in indeterminate space. Gorky favored a high-key palette during this period, working with acidic greens, sulfurous yellows, hot pinks, deep crimsons, and cerulean blues. These colors weren't naturalistic, but they carried intense emotional charge, evoking both pleasure and unease. One of Gorky's most distinctive technical innovations was his use of the staining method. He would apply very thin, fluid paint directly to raw or lightly primed canvas, allowing the pigment to soak into the fabric rather than sitting on top of it. This created passages where color and canvas became virtually indistinguishable, with the paint absorbed into the weave of the material itself. Areas of the canvas were often left unpainted or barely touched, creating a porous, breathing quality to the compositions. This technique would profoundly influence the color field painters who came after him, particularly Helen Frankenthaler, who saw in Gorky's stained surfaces a path toward a new kind of abstraction. But Gorky's technical sophistication went beyond paint application. He was also a compulsive draftsman, who generated hundreds of preparatory drawings for his paintings. This might seem to contradict the idea of spontaneity and automatism, but Gorky understood that true improvisation requires enormous preparation. He would make drawing after drawing, exploring variations on forms and spatial relationships, testing every edge and contour. Then, when he finally approached the canvas, he had internalized these possibilities so thoroughly that he could paint with apparent freedom while maintaining structural coherence. The paintings feel spontaneous because they capture the energy and directness of drawing, but they're actually the result of intense deliberation. The gestural quality of Gorky's brushwork became increasingly important in his late paintings. He would let paint drip and run down the canvas, incorporating accident and chance into the image. These drips weren't random, though. Gorky controlled them, using gravity and viscosity as compositional elements. The running paint created vertical passages that activated the surface, adding temporal dimension to the spatial composition. You can almost see the painting being made, sense the physical movement of the artist's hand, the tilt of the canvas, the exact moment when liquid pigment began its descent. This integration of process into final image was radical for its time, transforming the act of painting itself into visible content. Gorky's compositional strategies during his mature period moved decisively away from the centralized, hierarchical structures of traditional painting. Instead, he developed an all-over approach where forms proliferate across the entire canvas without a clear focal point. The eye travels continuously through these paintings, unable to rest, constantly discovering new configurations and relationships. This democratic distribution of forms across the picture plane was radically modern, anticipating the all-over compositions that Jackson Pollock would make famous just a few years later. But where Pollock's webs of paint are relatively uniform in density, Gorky's surfaces breathe, with areas of intense activity alternating with passages of openness and transparency. The spatial construction in these paintings is deliberately ambiguous. Gorky rejected the deep perspectival space of traditional Western painting, but he also avoided the completely flat picture plane that geometric abstractionists like Mondrian advocated. Instead, he created a shallow, fluctuating space where forms seemed to exist in multiple depth registers simultaneously. Some shapes appear to advance toward the viewer, others recede, but these spatial relationships keep shifting depending on how you read the linear and chromatic cues. This spatial instability creates a sense of psychological unease that's fundamental to the painting's emotional impact. The viewer can never settle into a stable reading of the image, which generates a productive anxiety that mirrors the artist's own unsettled psychic state. The scale of Gorky's late paintings is significant. Many are quite large, approaching or exceeding life-size dimensions. This wasn't just about making an impressive visual statement. The scale forces viewers into an immersive relationship with the image. Standing before one of these large canvases, your peripheral vision fills with Gorky's forms and colors, creating an enveloping experience that's almost environmental. The paintings don't just depict a world, they create one that temporarily surrounds and contains you. This bodily engagement with the work transforms viewing into an almost physical encounter, where you don't just see the painting, but feel yourself inside it. What makes Gorky's aesthetic so powerful is how it unites extreme opposites. The paintings are simultaneously controlled and spontaneous, abstract and suggestive, structured and organic, serene and anguished. They feel both ancient and utterly contemporary, evoking prehistoric cave paintings while pioneering techniques that would define late 20th century art. This ability to hold contradictions in productive tension gives the work its peculiar intensity and staying power. Nothing about these paintings can be reduced to a single mood or meaning. They remain perpetually open, endlessly interpretable, refusing to yield their secrets completely. The erotic charge in Gorky's imagery needs to be acknowledged frankly. Many of his biomorphic forms suggest sexual organs, bodily fluids, penetration, and coupling. This wasn't accidental or unconscious. Gorky deliberately channeled erotic energy into his paintings, understanding sexuality as a life force that could counterbalance death and trauma. The paintings from his happiest period, after his marriage to Agnes Magruder in 1941, are particularly saturated with this fertile, procreative energy. But even in these joyous canvases, there's always an undercurrent of something darker, more anxious. Gorky couldn't separate pleasure from pain, birth from death, desire from loss. His visual vocabulary fuses the generative and the destructive, the orgasmic and the mortal, into forms that embody both simultaneously. Memory functioned as a crucial organizing principle in Gorky's art. He painted from recollection rather than direct observation, even when those recollections were triggered by present experience. Walking through the Connecticut countryside with his wife, Gorky would lie on his back in the grass, staring up at leaves and sky, letting the immediate sensation blend with childhood memories of Armenian landscapes. This temporal layering, where past and present interpenetrate, gives the paintings their dreamlike quality. They exist in a perpetual present tense that somehow contains both remembrance and anticipation. The forms seem to materialize from memory, while simultaneously dissolving back into it, creating images that feel both vividly present and hauntingly distant. The influence of specific artistic traditions on Gorky's visual language deserves examination. His use of curvilinear forms and organic shapes connects back through Surrealism to Art Nouveau, and even further to Baroque painting. The compositional complexity of his late canvases, with their accumulation of forms interacting without losing individual identity, has roots in Baroque altarpieces and ceiling frescoes. This might seem like an odd connection for an abstract modernist, but Gorky thought seriously about the entire history of Western painting. He wanted to create an art that was radically new, but also continuous with that tradition, an art that honored the past while urgently addressing the present. His synthetic approach allowed him to be simultaneously revolutionary and traditional, avant-garde, and historically grounded. Technically, Gorky's mastery of chiaroscuro, the modulation of light and dark, remained sophisticated even in his most abstract work. He understood how to use tonal gradation to create volume and weight, how to make a flat-colored shape appear to turn in space through subtle variations in value. This classical training in rendering form never left him, even when he was ostensibly rejecting representation. The biomorphic shapes in his paintings have convincing plasticity, because Gorky knew how to make them feel three-dimensional through purely painterly means. He could suggest the roundness of a form, the way light falls across a surface, the recession of one shape behind another, all through manipulations of color and tone rather than through linear perspective or anatomical accuracy. The texture in Gorky's paintings varied dramatically across a single canvas. Some areas would be thick with impasto, where brushstrokes sat visibly on the surface, creating actual physical relief. Other passages were virtually weightless, just stained color soaking into raw canvas. Still other sections featured scumbled paint, where a dry brush dragged semi-opaque color across the surface, creating broken, irregular marks. These textural contrasts created a haptic richness that invited tactile as well as optical engagement. The paintings begged to be touched, though obviously they can't be. This tension between the visual and the tactile adds another layer of desire and frustration to the work. Another way the paintings embody longing that cannot be fully satisfied. Gorky's approach to pictorial edges and margins is worth noting. He often activated the very edges of the canvas, running forms right up to and sometimes over the picture's boundary. This creates the sense that the composition extends beyond what we can see, that the canvas is a window onto a larger, unknowable space. Conversely, he would sometimes leave large areas near the edges relatively empty, creating a vignette effect where activity concentrates toward the center and dissipates at the periphery. These varied approaches to how compositions meet their boundaries keep the work from feeling formulaic. Each painting establishes its own relationship between image and frame, between what's shown and what's implied beyond the visible limits. The emotional temperature in Gorky's paintings shifted significantly during his final years. The works from 1944 to 1946 are generally characterized by luminous, euphoric color and buoyant, celebratory forms. But as his life darkened with illness, a studio fire in 1946 that destroyed much of his work, a car accident in June 1948 that broke his neck and temporarily paralyzed his painting arm, and the dissolution of his marriage, the paintings became more sober, more compressed, more explicitly anguished. The colors darkened, the forms became more aggressive and spiky, the spatial pressure intensified. These late paintings anticipate the raw, tortured quality that would characterize much abstract expressionist work in the 1950s. They show an artist painting through catastrophe, refusing to surrender even as circumstances became unbearable. Understanding Gorky requires recognizing that he was fundamentally a tragic artist who made beautiful things. The beauty in his work isn't escapist or decorative. It's hard-won, carved out of experiences that would have justified utter despair. Gorky painted his way through trauma, using art as a means of psychic survival. The resulting paintings offer viewers not escape, but transformation, not answers, but the possibility of finding meaning through aesthetic experience. They demonstrate that beauty and suffering aren't opposites, but can coexist, can even emerge from one another in ways that neither diminish the pain nor trivialize the loveliness. His influence on the generation of artists who became known as abstract expressionists cannot be overstated. Willem de Kooning, who shared a studio with Gorky and considered him a mentor, learned from him how to unite drawing and painting, how to keep forms in productive ambiguity. Jackson Pollock saw in Gorky's all-over compositions and incorporation of dripping paint a path toward his own breakthrough. Mark Rothko absorbed lessons about the emotional power of stacked translucent color fields. Robert Motherwell recognized in Gorky's synthesis of European modernism and personal expression a model for American painting. These artists took Gorky's innovations in different directions, but they built on foundations he established. Without Gorky's example, the course of American art would have been fundamentally different. What distinguishes Gorky from his abstract expressionist successors is his retention of discernible form. He never fully abandoned the image, never went entirely non-objective. His paintings remain recognizably about something, even if that something resists clear identification. This makes them more accessible than the pure abstractions of Pollock or Rothko, but also more ambiguous, more unsettling. The viewer is constantly engaged in an act of interpretation, trying to decode forms that deliberately resist definitive reading. This interpretive openness is central to what makes the paintings continue to reward sustained attention. They never exhaust their possibilities, never yield everything at once. The materiality of paint itself became increasingly important in Gorky's late work. He exploited the physical properties of oil paint, its viscosity, its translucency when thinned, its opacity when applied thickly, its drying time, its capacity to hold a mark. He understood paint not just as a means of creating images, but as a substance with its own qualities and behaviors that could be orchestrated into meaning. This attention to medium as content, to the what of painting being inseparable from the how, was crucial for everything that followed in post-war American art. Gorky helped establish that paintings could be about painting itself, about the physical and sensory experience of making marks on a surface, while still carrying profound emotional and psychological weight. The relationship between control and surrender in Gorky's working method reveals much about his understanding of creativity. He prepared obsessively through drawing, establishing a vocabulary of forms and relationships. But when executing a painting, he would allow for accident and improvisation, letting the materials partly determine the outcome. This balance between intention and chance, between what the artist plans and what the process reveals, became central to abstract expressionist practice. Gorky showed that you could be both rigorous and spontaneous, that discipline and freedom weren't contradictory, but mutually enabling. Gorky died at 44, hanging himself in a barn in Sherman, Connecticut on July 21, 1948. He left behind roughly 700 paintings, and many times that number of drawings. It's impossible not to wonder what he might have accomplished with more time, how his work might have continued to evolve. But what exists is already monumental. Gorky created a body of work that transformed American painting, that expanded the expressive possibilities of abstraction, that demonstrated how personal trauma could be transmuted into images of heartbreaking beauty. His achievement stands as proof that art matters, that painting can do things nothing else can, that beauty carved from suffering has a different quality than beauty that comes easily. His art reveals what painting can do that nothing else can. It shows how color, form, gesture, and texture can conjure felt experience, can access layers of consciousness that words cannot reach. Gorky's paintings don't illustrate emotions, they enact them, creating in viewers the very feelings they embody. Standing before his best work, you don't observe suffering or joy or desire from a distance. You feel them coursing through you, activated by purely visual means. That's the revelation at the heart of Gorky's achievement. The discovery that abstract form could carry the full weight of human experience, that paint on canvas could speak with the intensity of music or poetry while remaining irreducibly itself, visual and mute and eloquent. In an age increasingly dominated by words and images that explain themselves, Gorky's paintings remind us that some truths can only be approached obliquely, through forms that resist translation, through beauty that refuses to comfort.